Welcome back to The Heat. Joining us now from Johannesburg is Ayabonga Cawe. He's an Economic Justice Program Manager with Oxfam South Africa and the co-founder of Rethink Africa. Also from Johannesburg is Tshepo Kgadima. He's the CEO and President of Lontohcoal Limited and a member of the African National Congress. And here with us in the studio is Kenneth Mwenda. He's a Rhodes Scholar, the author of 29 scholarly books and a Professor of Law at the University of Pretoria. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Ayabonga, when we look at these protests in South Africa, they're pretty robust protests. They've got very violent in many instances. Is there a feeling among students in South Africa that they've been left behind? Indeed, there may be that feeling among large parts of the South African population as well, that in post-apartheid South Africa, they've just been left behind.
I think certainly the entry point of the protests is the question of fees and the chronic underfunding of the higher education and tertiary sector in South Africa. But I do think that, the students in many ways, I think, using the fees question as an entry point, are beginning to ask other questions within the society. Chief among those questions is how some of the unresolved grievances that students are beginning to ask, what is the kind of aspirational template do we want for our tertiary institutions? Not only for our tertiary institutions, but also what is the aspirational template of the kind of society we want to build? And certainly, I think within that, there is this sense that many of the students who come from working class and poor communities have been left behind by some of the sort of strides that have occurred in the economy. And many still feel that even though they are in tertiary education, that there's a real perception that many of them have been closed out of the mainstream economy. So it's not just about fees, but I think it's also about how do we address some of the genuine socioeconomic grievances across the society.
Right, Tshepo, I think it's fair to say that higher education in South Africa is in a state of turmoil right now. We just heard from Professor Adim Habib from the University of the Witwatersrand. What is your assessment of what is going on South African campuses right now?
Yeah, look, South Africa is at a strategic inflection point, and the fees must fall movement, if it were organized, certainly I think that would have brought us to that strategic inflection point. And the question that I find that it is missing largely from this fees must fall movement is that of what actually constitutes higher education or tertiary education. We've seen by and large that the protests, which unfortunately some of them have been violent, have been led largely by university students. But the further questions that I certainly believe are missing from the debate is what actually constitutes tertiary education or higher education, and if so, once we determine what is tertiary education, to say is the current form of delivering tertiary education being through a classroom, is it still the most relevant and the most appropriate? Or are there technological advancements that can assist us to have our nation overall actually being able to have equitable access to education? So by and large, I think that it is lamentable that the debate and the discussion and the protests have only been limited to only the singular issue of fees without taking into account and considering the much more bigger issues that we face as a nation of ensuring that we have an educated society and an educated citizenry that can indeed help and assist in the economic and sociological transformation and development of this nation.
Right, Kenneth, what we're hearing here is that this fee increase protests, it goes a lot beyond that, doesn't it?
It's a bigger question, Anand. If you look at the whole sort of crisis started about 2015, there is also the feeling of sort of decolonize the higher education system coming through that, to a large extent, higher education has been a privilege of a certain demographic society in South Africa. And so the marginalized are feeling like, look, we need to redress this anomaly.
What does that mean, decolonize education?
Good question. For the most part, if you look at statistics, for example, the larger population of academics are mainly whites in universities in South Africa. And so this is more than 2 decades after apartheid. And so there's a feeling, even from amongst the students and some academics, minorities, that, look, we need to have more diversity and inclusion in higher education. So that's one dimension. Then you have the issue of inequality of incomes. Now, ideally, the world over, public universities, we're talking of public universities and not private universities, have mainly three sources of revenue. One, government subsidies, and then tuition fees, and the third usually is private sources, endowments from alumni and so forth. But we don't have a critical mass of alumni on the African continent who can make big endowments like you have maybe here in the States at places like Harvard. So the universities really are left to look to the two primary sources of funding, which is government subsidies and tuition fees. And I think the government of South Africa has tried to try and sort of improve the situation. The statistics are now showing that to meet the shortfall, if they have to deliver quality education, we're talking about 71 billion rands as a shortfall to try and address some of these anomalies. But that's not the end in itself. I think higher education sector all over the continent now, we need to rethink how we deliver higher education. It's no longer the era of state-owned enterprises where these are public entities, they just rely on government services. There are other revenue-generating ventures which public institutions can get into. For example, they can run businesses, commercial enterprises. They can own commercial real estate from which they can get rentals and so forth. Universities in developed countries do that. So we've identified the problem, but we need to look at the solutions.
But when we see what is going on right here, well, look, nothing is free. I mean, you can talk about free education.
That's
Someone
true.
is going to have to pay for it.
Right.
South Africa's own national development plan calls for 1.6 million graduates by the year 2030.
Right.
It's falling behind, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, if you look at Germany, for example, Germany, Norway, they're pushing for free education. And so I think South African students are trying to sort of model that approach. But Germany is certainly an advanced economy.
Right.
And I don't think South Africa can afford to do that. And in any event, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, it's not unusual the type of fees that are being charged in South Africa. You're talking about annual fees, academic fees ranging from $1,000 US to about $2,000 US. That's really nothing. It's a drop in the ocean.
It's low.
Yeah. Compared, for example, to the US. Of course, you can talk of kids coming from low-income families and so forth. They wouldn't afford. But there are ways in which you can address that. You can have, for example, scholarships which are merit-based to try and address some of those anomalies. Scholarships for the underprivileged. You can have those type of schemes.
Okay. Let me get back to Johannesburg.
Yes.
Ayabonga, students have a good cause. They have genuine grievances. But are they not undermining it by resorting to violence in many of these protests, destruction of university property as well? And perhaps in one of their most astounding actions, they were burning down libraries.
Look, I think there's two dimensions to that question. The first one is, from the perspective of the student movement itself. And I think there are many leaders within the student movement who have come out and said they distance themselves from some of the acts of violence that have not only happened on campuses, but also on the streets that happen to sit alongside some of these campuses. But on the other hand, I think we must also acknowledge that there's been a high level of provocation of students. If you look, for instance, what happened in Fees Must Fall in 2015, since that moment up until now in October 2016 and now even in November, you have not had, for instance, at the University of the Witwatersrand here in Johannesburg, any day on campus over that year where you didn't have private security on campuses. Now, universities are places for the sharing of knowledge, the dissemination of knowledge, and the generation of knowledge. And I think even in instances where there wasn't large mass action on campuses, you still had this overarching and very intimidating presence of security on campuses. And I think in that kind of environment, you're likely to have a situation where a lot of anger escalates into violence at the behest and provocation of some of these private security companies.
Okay. Tshepo, how serious is the government about resolving this problem? We know that the country's President Jacob Zuma has put together a group of cabinet ministers to address the issue. Also, state security officials are in this group, but he excluded the finance minister. That's a man who holds the country's purse strings. Does this tell us that the president is serious about addressing this, or is he playing politics with it?
Look, my own assessment is, from what I have seen, is that clearly the government and even those that are involved, the students themselves, the members of the academic staff at these various universities, nobody really has the answer, because if they did, by now we should have seen some sort of a academic literature or research report that would have come out to really give us what are the tangible, appropriate measures that can be put in place. What the government has done to some extent, that is of appointing a commission of inquiry that is just recently released an interim report into its work. I had hoped that that by and large would have convinced the students who are protesting that indeed something is being done, but will that which is being done be to their satisfaction? The answer is no, if one takes into account our very dire economic climate we find ourselves in, where in fact we are now on the verge of slipping into negative growth,
right,
with an economic policy which is clearly neoliberal. It is certainly means that the government has got very limited financial resources largely to be able to deliver education free to all. And I do not believe that the call that there should be a blanket free education access, regardless of the income levels or the social standing, is itself a correct call, as much as it might be desired, but not necessarily in the current climate that we find ourselves as a country. So certainly I think that all the parties that are involved in this certainly are to take an element of blame, and the students, I had hoped that by now they should have really taken into account these very serious things, because we say that these are the leaders of tomorrow. These students that are in these academic institutions are the very people that we are looking towards them taking the mantle of leadership, and certainly now, in my opinion, they are failing that test. In fact, their conduct is counterproductive to their cause.
Okay, yeah, that interim report that you talked about, that was given to the President on Friday. We talked about it earlier, and it didn't actually tell us much. Kenneth, has the government of South Africa got its spending priorities right? I mean, as Tshepo pointed out, there's a finite amount of money.
Right. I mean, again, if you look at issues facing the Treasury, it's a question of different priorities that the Minister of Finance sets, of course, in consultation with the Reserve Bank, the governor of the Reserve Bank, who handles monetary policy. But really, we cannot prejudge them, because right now there's a commission of inquiry that is going on the fees. But what I want to point out is that I think we need to depoliticize our universities on the continent. You know, the universities are not a medium or channel where to air grievances which are of a partisan political nature, masquerading as intellectual arguments. And I think that is very common in Africa. Now, I do understand the grievances of the students, but let's be realistic. There's nowhere in the world, in Africa included, where you're going to get free education. Not even in the poorer parts of Africa. South Africa is a much stronger economy. And South Africa, if you look at the rankings of universities, the top 10 universities, starting with UCT, University of Cape Town, they're all South African universities. They have something that they can hold on to in terms of a quality education. But if we're going to retain the best university lecturers, best academicians, we have to be competitive. There's no doubt about it. And that requires resources. Yes, the government needs to probably give much more consideration to higher education, but I wouldn't preempt them or prejudge them as having gotten their priorities wrong.
So you say the government has to do that, but is there that same recognition of South African universities and their value among students?
Right. Yes, I mean, I hope the students do realize that. The damage has been estimated about close to 44 million rands, I think, in damage to property, as at the latest reports that I saw. And I hope that this violence can come to an end. I mean, we've seen African universities at independence. They all started with all these lofty perks of free education. Eventually, most African universities had to charge. There are a lot of international students in South Africa today, and they're not complaining because they know where they're coming from. That is equally the same thing. So South African students also, I think, need to get a bit of exposure about the international best practices, what happens elsewhere. When you look around the world, you learn something rather than being very parochial and inside looking, thinking that, you know, you can just get free things.
Right, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us.